The allure of working closely with dangerous exotic animals can lead so-called animal experts to develop a false sense of familiarity, spending extensive time in the presence of these creatures. Sadly, these experts become so accustomed to their routines that they overlook the inherent risks, underestimating the animal's instincts and the potential for danger. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times animal experts have been fatally attacked by the animals they loved so much. Welcome to Final Affliction.
It was September 4th, 2006. Another day at work for 44-year-old Steve Irwin as he loaded his truck with supplies and equipment and set off for the Bat Reef near Port Douglas in northeastern Australia. He and his crew were preparing to shoot underwater footage for an upcoming documentary called Ocean's Deadliest for the Discovery Channel, directed by John Stanton. For several days prior to the scheduled shoot, John couldn't shake an eerie feeling that something bad was about to happen. He talked to his friends and producer requesting to call off the documentary, but the channel had already spent too much money on the project and could not afford further delays. But John Stanton still had an uneasy sensation that something would go wrong. He drafted a will and reluctantly set off for the reef, accompanied by Steve Irwin and his cameraman Justin Lyons. On the morning of September 4th, after arriving at the small town near Port Douglas, they boarded Steve Irwin's 75-foot research boat called the Croc 1 and sailed to the Bat Reef, near the Great Barrier Reef on the eastern Australian coast. The area hosted various species of marine life, including sea turtles, dolphins, and whales, but the crew wanted to encounter a shark to film for this episode, and so they donned their suits and put on their snorkels for a dive into the water. The sea was muddier than usual, and Steve and his cameraman Justin could not find a safe spot to look for a wandering shark. They decided it was best to call off the shoot for the day, as it was not the right time. But before they left, Steve Irwin spotted something that piqued his interest. It was not a shark, but a beautiful stingray. These marine animals could grow up to 5 meters or 16 feet in length, including a long, piercing tail of which they had great control and agility. It was their primary weapon in the underwater ecosystem. But Steve Irwin was not irked by the creature. He had been doing this his entire life and knew that stingrays were not known to attack humans unless provoked or accidentally stomped on. Steve swam closer to the animal until it was right beneath him. He thought this was the perfect angle to film some shots for his daughter Bindy's upcoming wildlife children's show called Bindy the Jungle Girl. He signaled his cameraman to swim down to him and start filming the animal. It was a serene sight. In the backdrop of the colorful ocean floor, stingrays had seldom been observed in such close proximity, as they would usually swim off or bury themselves in the sand upon encounters with humans. As Justin Lyons swam closer to Steve Irwin, they were blissfully ignorant of what was about to happen next. Steve Irwin was now only a few feet above the stingray, trying to work out the best angle to get a shot. But as he hovered closer, the stingray suddenly lunged its long, sharp tail upwards, slicing through Steve Irwin's chest. He didn't immediately realize the magnitude of the attack, and a numbing sensation engulfed his body for a few seconds. In the commotion of the water before they tried to swim back up, Steve Irwin instructed Justin to keep the camera rolling. Even in such dire circumstance, he wanted to get something out of the encounter. Justin Lyon, however, was painfully aware of what had just happened. There was a large 2-inch hole in Steve's chest, and he was now bleeding profusely, turning the surrounding water red. Fearing that the blood could attract a nearby shark, Justin grabbed Steve Irwin and urged him to swim up to safety. When they resurfaced, the gravity of his injuries became immediately clear. Steve Irwin was now in excruciating pain and losing blood fast. He screamed to Justin that his lungs had been punctured by the brutal attack, but the reality was far worse. The stingray's tail had cut into the side of Steve's heart, and the massive blood loss meant that he could lose his life in a few short minutes. Justin Lyons screamed to the crew on the boat that Steve Irwin was badly injured and needed help fast. The colleagues frantically threw him on an inflatable speedboat and quickly tried to get him to land. All the while they were with Steve, he displayed an indomitable spirit. He was losing consciousness, and as Justin and the crew forced weight on the wound to stop the bleeding, they called on him to stay alive for the sake of his family and his 2 children. Steve Irwin realized these were indeed his final moments, and calmly said he was going to die as they administered CPR. A few minutes later, he stopped moving. His eyes closed and his face turned blue. Steve Irwin, famed wildlife conservationist and beloved TV presenter, was dead.
Got a beautiful white blaze on his chest. Oh. He thinks I'm gonna take the banana off him. I gave him the banana.
And what do you want to be when you grow up?
Just like my daddy.
Just like your daddy.
Australian crocodile hunter Steve Irwin has died during a diving expedition near Port Douglas in Australia.
He was a charismatic crocodile hunter who cheated death again and again.
Terry Irwin has spoken of the loss of the man she called the love of her life. In a statement read by Steve's dad, she thanked the thousands who offered their condolences, and she's decided his public memorial will be held where Steve felt most comfortable, the crocodile pen at Australia Zoo.
Paramedics were called on the shore for a faint chance of resuscitating him, but it only took them a few seconds to declare that Steve Irwin had succumbed to his injuries and passed away. Even if he had been taken to a hospital, there was little chance that he could survive a strike straight into his heart. The stingray's razor-sharp tail had cut through Steve's chest, and he died among the animals and wildlife he had loved and cherished his entire life. The entire ordeal, from the stab of the stingray's tail to the final moments that the paramedics were trying to revive Steve Irwin, were captured on Justin Lyon's camera. But in respect for Steve's fighting spirit and to save his family the pain of witnessing the scene of his death, Justin deleted the final copy of the tape after a brief police investigation. The footage was never seen or released, but the sight of Steve's horrifying and painful final moments remained forever ingrained in the memory of the crew on board and the colleagues that loved and cherished him. His wife and children were on a trip in Tasmania when they heard the news of Steve Irwin's demise, and they were devastated and inconsolable at the tragic loss of their husband and father. His wife Terry and his children Bindi and Rob immediately traveled to the Australia Zoo, which Steve Irwin had run, and were met with love and consolation from thousands of adoring fans outside. Steve Irwin had earlier remarked that he would consider his final purpose in life fulfilled if he could pass on the torch of nature conservation to his children. In keeping with their father's wish, Bindi and Rob became dedicated zookeepers and conservationists and worked to carry on Steve Irwin's legacy in honor of his tragic and untimely final affliction.
Kellyanne and Michael Walz lived on a picturesque property set on a hilltop, surrounded by friendly neighbors who they got along very well with. Looking at the pair, you'd never suspect them of being different from any other married couple. But in reality, they had a very unusual hobby. Michael and Kellyanne liked to collect animals, and not just any animals. They had an affinity for exotic predators. You'd think that the neighbors would be worried about all of these murderous creatures in such close proximity to their homes and children. But according to them, the Walzes were excellent pet owners. Their cages were sturdy and secure. They had all of the proper licensing, and they passed every annual inspection of their property. The neighbors even made a game of spooking their visitors with the roars that echoed across the outskirts of Ross Township, Pennsylvania. In 1994, Michael procured a license to house exotic animals from across the seas, and they spent the next few years slowly filling their property with all sorts of dangerous meat eaters that could growl the pants off even the bravest men. A lion, 2 serval cats, a jaguar, a tiger, and a leopard. But their biggest and most loved animal was a fully grown black bear by the name of Teddy. Michael had the paperwork that gave him the right to sell and trade the animals that they kept. He could have even charged the public to visit his property like a mini zoo, but that wasn't what Michael and Kellyanne were about. They just adored creatures that would normally scare the rest of us senseless. They saw the beauty in them where others couldn't, and if the neighbors were ever worried, well, they were encouraged to come and inspect the property themselves. The couple loved nothing more than to share their love for wild animals with their acquaintances, and their community found the pair and all of their animals quite charming. Even their next-door neighbor, Scott Castone, who had 2 young children, spoke very highly of the Walzes and what stellar animal keepers they were. He never once worried that the carnivorous cats would escape. Scott inspected their cages himself, and he visited his friends all the time, often bringing his own kids along. But it would be this very complacency that was to blame for the events that unfolded on that fateful day of October 2009. Kellyanne herself raised Teddy since he was a cub, and the couple spoiled him with treats and attention. Teddy's favorite snack was popcorn, and he was Kellyanne's pride and joy. Teddy was 350 pounds of pure muscle that was kept behind a 15 by 15 foot steel and concrete cage. In nature, black bears aren't exactly known for their tolerance of humans, but the handful that have been kept by people are reported to be much more mild-mannered than grizzlies. Unless it comes to food and they're young, then black bears are just as likely as any other wild animal to get aggressive. It's just in their natures, and no amount of training can override natural instinct. And to bring an even more serious tone to this situation, Teddy was even bigger than his kind normally grew to be. He had always been fed the best food. He never had to fight to survive, and he had never known sickness or hard times. Teddy was a black bear in his prime. Not only was he unimaginably strong and heavy, he stood at a height that was twice as tall as a man. The 6th of October was a Sunday, and the day started off cold and wet. A typical muggy fall morning in Pennsylvania, and a typical day for Kelly. After Michael left for the day, she and her own 2 children headed out bright and early to feed their many animals. Sunday was also the day that Kelly cleaned all of the cages on their land, so this was going to be a long and busy morning for her. Her first stop was always Teddy's cage. Kelly never missed a day where she didn't greet her beloved Teddy first. Kelly waved to her neighbor Scott over the fence. He was already up and about with his own 2 children, tending to some odd jobs around his house that he'd been putting off all week. Scott's kids waved hello to their friends before turning back to help their father. Kelly's children hung back on the porch. The night's sleep hadn't quite left them, and they were still too groggy to show much enthusiasm for the day just yet. But Kelly didn't mind. She loved spending her mornings with the animals, and most of all, with Teddy. She rode the wheelbarrow right to the edge of the cage's door. She needed to shovel up Teddy's messes before laying down some fresh straw to keep his paws clear of the muddy ground. But before she entered the cage, Teddy got a shovelful of food. That shovel wasn't going to be enough to fill the gigantic bear's stomach, but it was enough to keep him occupied while she wheeled her tools in through the door. It's not like she wanted to keep Teddy occupied enough to ignore herself. He'd never shown any aggression toward Kelly after all. But she did want to keep Teddy busy enough not to notice the open door. The bear wouldn't hesitate to leave his enclosure if he was given half the chance. But food was an even bigger incentive than freedom, so Teddy never even bothered to look up from his breakfast while Kelly got busy. Teddy knew the drill by now, and he was excitedly awaiting his treat. Standing on his hind legs, he pawed at the cage and growled a deep good morning to his owner. Teddy was going through the usual motions because that was what was expected of him. But, in truth, Teddy was not in a good mood at all. Everything in Teddy's body was telling him that it was time to go into hibernation. Autumn was in full swing, and this is usually the time when black bears got ready to take that long slumber. Teddy had been pacing his cage for the past week. Back and forth, looking for a way out to get to the woods where he belonged. The frustration was building up, and his owners, who usually saw him during the excitement of feeding time, didn't notice the bear's growing agitation. But for now, Teddy was seemingly happily rooting around in his pile of food. Kellyanne dragged the wheelbarrow inside with the shovel in hand, and the first few shovels of waste bedding that she hauled into the wheelbarrow went without incident. When her load was nearly overflowing, she put her shovel aside and turned to wheel the first load of mess out the door. But this sudden movement was all that Teddy needed to awaken that primal force within him. His natural instinct to protect his food, coupled with that volatile irritation that came with the need to hibernate outside in nature, just exploded out of the animal. Teddy did not see the woman who raised him, he just saw a potential threat. And with speed that belied his massive size, the beast landed on Kellyanne in one smooth bound. The air in Kelly's lungs whooshed out of her as almost 400 pounds rammed her to the ground, and by the time there was air in her lungs again to scream, Teddy had already had his jaws sunk into her shoulder. The ferocious roars and Kelly's screaming traveled to Scott's yard. He looked up with a frown that quickly turned into a look of horror when he saw the bloodbath that was unfolding in front of him. The air was alive with noise. Both his and Kelly's children were screaming hysterically. Kelly's kids had run into the house the moment the bear attacked. His enclosure was open, and they were going to be next if they didn't get out of the way fast. Scott leapt into action. It took him 30 seconds to run to his house, get his sidearm, load it, and sprint across his yard. When he reached Teddy's enclosure, Kelly was lying motionless on the ground, just a few feet from the open door. If Scott didn't know what happened, he never would have recognized the torn and broken human being that lay before him. Teddy was still on top of her. He gave the body one last shake, and when it became clear that his target was deceased, Teddy turned to the next threat before him, and that threat was Scott. The man was only a few feet away. Teddy could cover that distance in just 4 strides, but Scott was ready. The bear went low, gearing to storm at Scott on all fours, but before the beast could take 2 steps, Scott pulled the trigger, and he pulled it again and again and again. The first bullet hit Teddy in the abdomen. His thick fur and copious amounts of fat shielded him from most of the damage. It wasn't nearly enough to bring him down. Teddy recoiled from the blast, but he recovered in a split second and took a step forward. Then the second round hit him, and that was the lethal one. It hit the creature in the neck. Even without the shots that followed, that torn airway rendered his breathing obsolete. The animal hit the earth with a force that shook the ground like a freight train went past. Even the children inside the house felt the shockwave from the floorboards beneath their feet. Of the 5 shots fired, Scott managed to get 2 into the animal's skull. Even if Teddy had enough oxygen left in him for one last attack, those final rounds were more than enough to cut any remaining signs of life short instantly. And with that, 2 beings lay dead on the ground. Kellyanne, a woman who left behind 2 children and a husband who adored her, and yet now her torn and broken body lay under the canopy of the autumn rain, forever gone from this world. A life ended in less than a minute, and the other was a majestic beast, the iconic black bear that millions of stuffed toys are modeled after. If it weren't for the screams of the children, Scott would have stared at the gruesome scene in shock for hours. Next door, Scott's kids called 911 when they heard the shots ring out, but the paramedics just arrived to remove the bodies. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Scott and all of the children are traumatized by the events of the day. Scott can at least find solace in the fact that his actions almost certainly saved lives. If Teddy had made it out of the Walz's yard, the bear, already in a blind rage, would have attacked the first living thing that he came across. But these events did leave plenty of food for thought. How could Kelly have just left that gate wide open? Why was there no separate holding cage to keep the bear in while she cleaned? But the Walz's neighbors came to their defense. In all ways, Kellyanne did everything that the state required of an exotic keeper, and the bear was, by all accounts, tame and friendly. The fact of the matter is, no matter how young you get them, wild animals are just that, wild animals. Complacency is not a sin. Kellyanne has done this routine 1,000 times with no problems at all. Number 1001 just happened to be the perfect storm. The change in season, food to protect, and natural instincts were just the perfect recipe for disaster. So while the news spread and the world had plenty of criticism to throw at the situation, there are children who lost their mother, a husband who lost his wife, and a whole community left reeling in shock. And then there's Scott Castone, the man who did not hesitate to face down one of the biggest animals that walks on land to save his friend, his children, and the community at large. There are 2 lessons that we can take away from this terrible event. One is that animals belong in the wild, no matter how much we love them and even how much they love us. Natural instinct is stronger than love for the creatures that are wild. And secondly, we can celebrate the bravery of the members of our community. Scott couldn't save Kellyanne, but he did save others from being attacked. There are still heroes out there willing to put their lives on the line so others won't have to meet their terrifying final affliction.
Nestled in the far eastern reaches of Russia is a land of wild beauty and rugged wilderness, the Kamchatka Peninsula. Here, the earth boils and steams with hot springs and geysers shooting steam high into the sky. It is a place of raw power where the earth itself seems to be alive and breathing. It is also home to an array of wildlife, from the majestic brown bear to the elusive snow leopard, where they roam the land freely in harmony with the landscape. For those who dare to venture into its depths, the Kamchatka Peninsula offers an unforgettable experience, as the beauty of nature is on full display and the wilderness of the land can be felt in every breath. Vitaly Nikolayenko was one of Russia's best-known bear researchers to date. He had dedicated almost 30 years, which was approximately half of his life, to researching these majestic creatures. The 66-year-old was also a senior ranger in the Kronotsky Wildlife Reserve, where he constantly patrolled the wilderness to battle illegal fishing and hunting. It was during these patrols that Vitaly followed the enormous brown bears of the Kamchatka Peninsula while documenting their social, mating, and feeding habits. In the evening, he would return to his cabin, light the kerosene lamp, and then document nearly 800 bear contacts annually. His work turned into one of the most significant records of brown bear behavior ever made. As the years passed, Vitaly plunged into repeated encounters with bears. He got very close and personal with the bears, who seemed to not mind sharing their space with him. His personal favorite was a 6-foot male bear that he had named Krasavchik, which means handsome. He was fond of Krasavchik and at times would lie next to the beast as it took a nap. In December 2003, Vitaly had stayed on the reserve instead of leaving his home to celebrate the holiday season. He had stayed longer than expected while finishing up his research on why some of the bears had not yet gone to their dens. Being winter, the bears were supposed to have gone into hibernation, warmly tucked into a hollow tree or under the roots of a huge tree. It was a Friday, and Vitaly was sitting by the window in his cabin with his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland. The trees were heavy with snow as their branches bent low under the weight. He took a sip of his tea, savoring the warmth as it spread through his body. He felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease as a sense of calmness washed over him. He had just finished packing and was waiting for his flight out of the reserve. As he stared out at the snow-covered landscape, Vitaly felt a sense of peace. The cold and the silence of the winter seemed to soothe his soul, and for a moment, he could not help but picture the warm reception he would get from Tatiana, his wife, upon his arrival. Her laughter was music to his ears. Her voice and grace made his worries and cares fade away. He missed her. He sipped his tea, lost in thought as the winter world unfolded before him. He watched as the snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, with each one a unique and delicate creation. It was as if he was seeing the world through new eyes, a new dimension. This filled him with a sense of wonder and awe. And then he saw him. It was Krasavchik. His furry friend was headed to the half-frozen lake to quench his thirst. To kill the boredom, Vitaly decided to follow his favorite bear down to the lake, where he was sure to capture some award-winning pictures and memories to last a lifetime. He geared up and took with him his camera, flare gun, and bear spray, just in case things got out of hand. The lake was less than a mile from his cabin, and so he was sure he would be back before his helicopter arrived. As he stepped out into the snow, he felt the air was crisp and cold with a sharpness that seemed to cut through to the bone. His breath was puffing out clouds and the landscape was eerily quiet, as if the Kamchatka Peninsula itself was holding its breath. But he was no stranger to the harsh elements of this area, so he soldiered on. The growl of his friendly bear quickly freed him from his thoughts. He tried to trudge through the snow-covered trail in order to catch up, but the snow was deep and his feet were heavy. But he was determined. He quickly put on his cross-country skis, which allowed him to effortlessly glide across the snow-covered trail. He could see the bear's paw prints still fresh in the snow and was determined to keep up with Krasovchik. He pushed himself to go faster, his muscles strained and burned with exertion at the effort of pushing himself to the limit. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but he did not falter. He tightened his coat around him. The trail wound its way through the trees, and he followed it cautiously with his senses heightened by the knowledge that a bear was nearby. Moments later, he saw Krasovchik. There he was in a grove, sleeping soundly. His usually brown fur was now gleaming in the winter sunlight. This was going to be the perfect picture as a reward for his turmoil in the harsh weather. Vitaly took out his camera, but taking a clear picture was impossible as the snow-covered branches and tree trunks kept getting in his way. He then made the risky decision to get inside the grove. He took his skis and stuck them vertically in the snow, got down on all fours, and then crawled, ducking and weaving through the tight spaces as he made his way through the branches. His eyes were fixed on his friend Krasovchik and his senses alert. He could hear his heavy but rhythmic breathing as he struggled to make his way through the pouring snow. The sound was almost peaceful, a big contrast to the natural ferocity of the bear. His chest rose and fell with each inhale, and with each exhale, a small plume of steam escaped from his nostrils, dissipating into the chilly air. It was a sight that melted Vitaly's heart. At about 3 meters from the sleeping bear, Vitaly took out his camera, ready to capture the beautiful scene for his memory book, as he had done numerous times before. On Saturday, the following day, the helicopter arrived, ready to airlift Vitaly out of the reserve for his holiday. The pilot found packed bags and a cold cup of tea by the cabin's window, but Vitaly was nowhere to be seen. He, without hesitation, called the search and rescue team, which arrived promptly and began searching. They followed Vitaly's ski trail, and just about a mile from the cabin, they found his skis at the entrance of the grove, placed vertically in the snow, just as he had done the day before. The rescue team then followed Vitaly's tracks into the grove, and just about 3 meters in, there he was. Vitaly's body lay there motionless. His bear spray can was empty, which led the rescue team to believe that he had used it to try to save his life. In the snow, they could see Krasovchik's tracks where he leapt to attack Vitaly. It seemed that the spray hadn't deterred the bear from attacking him. On his right side lay the unfired flare gun, which was half eaten. His camera lay inches away from his body. It was bloody and broken. The search and rescue team brought his lifeless body back from the wilderness for goodbyes and burial from his family. Despite his numerous research journals, Vitaly's proactive approach of monitoring bears was broadly criticized by the conservation movement community, who argued that he went against the consensual passive method of ethology. In his defense, Vitaly claimed that he never underestimated the tenacity of the bears, but this wasn't how his critics saw it, as to them, his death seemed to be a confirmation of their worries. In addition, in excess of over 20 bears that had become habituated in the presence of Vitaly were easy targets for poachers and were killed just before and shortly after his death. As it is with nature, wild animals are just that, wild. One shouldn't get too comfortable when approaching wildlife, as their wild traits are intrinsically imprinted in their genetics, and they can snap at any time, leaving behind a lifeless body. For Vitaly, this was a lesson learned a bit too late, but his journals shall forever be a constant reminder of his contribution to the science and academic community. He was a great loss to both man and nature, and the very animal he based his life around ultimately led to his final affliction.